Open your Bibles to 1 Samuel 13. I'm going to preach a short message tonight concerning a very popular phrase that I've used often, a verse that I've used often, and I've preached on many different times. 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. It reads, "But now thy kingdom shall not continue," speaking to Saul. "The Lord had sought him a man after his own heart. And the Lord had commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee." So the Lord had sought him a man after his own heart. Now we know that is David. David would eventually become king. So we have this verse here in 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. And we know, if we read the verse, what type of person the Lord was seeking. One that, if you go to the end of the verse, which will prove my point when I get there, that the Lord was looking for someone that would follow his instructions. Because it says, that which the Lord commanded thee. Saul did not keep what the Lord commanded for him to do. Now I also want you to highlight a man after his own heart, because that's used quite often. I've used it. But even though I've used it, even though I've heard it all my life, there was something missing. And I knew there was something missing, the way I understood this verse. Not just this verse. Let's go to Acts chapter 13. Verse 22. Acts 13, verse 22. That reads, "And when he had removed him," who's the him? Saul, "he raised up unto them David to be their king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart." And once again, how does it finish here? "Which shall fulfill all my will." A man after mine own heart. Well, you really think about it. If you look at David in the flesh, how could he be a man after God's own heart? I mean, he did some great things. He killed Goliath. He put his faith and trust in God for victory over his enemies. And you can say, well, that's what God means. But what about all those other things that happened in David's life? Mistakes that cost tens of thousands of lives? Citizens that he was king over? Adultery? And then arranged a murder, a sure murder, for the husband that he was committing adultery with his wife. David was no angel. Far from it. So if you take the good things along with the bad things, he sure couldn't govern his family, that's for sure. Look at Absalom and some of his family members. This was not a perfect person. This is not even anything close to a perfect person. Many of you, in a morality scale, would probably do a lot better than David did if both of you were judged side by side. So how can this be a man after God's own heart? Because it was a man that fulfilled God's will. And this is an often misunderstood sentence or phrase that we find here in the Scriptures. Particularly among those unfamiliar with literal translations of Bible English. A man after God's own heart. This phrase is used to characterize David, not only what we saw in 1 Samuel 13:14, but also here in Acts 13:22, a man after God's own heart. And depending how you hear this preached, or maybe it's something that you read, typically this phrase suggests that David consistently strived to obtain God's favor, or God's love, putting in effort to earn his love, and so on. Is that what it really means? I say no. And the confusion stems from our usage of the word heart. Go on the screen. Oh, that's an H. Let's scratch that out of there. Heart. Like I said, the confusion stems from our usage of the word heart. We like to think about when this is used in the passages to describe feelings. Let's write that down. Particularly love. Now, is that what the Hebrew and biblical Greek terms for heart mean? No. They do not specifically allude to feelings. But that's the way you hear it preached a lot or written about. Somehow it's connected to feelings. The word heart in the Greek and Hebrew alludes to the mind. Let's write that down. As a whole. W-H-O-L-E. That's why the Bible refers to God's heart in terms of his intentions or ideas rather than his feelings. Now, the biblical authors did not use words for the heart, but rather for the intestines and kidneys. I'll just put I plus K. For the intestines and kidneys. Lower organs. When they were referring to emotions. You come back to me. Go to Colossians. To give you an example of that, in the New Testament, chapter 3, verse 12. That reads, "Put on therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercy." Mercies. Bowels of mercies. Back to the intestines and kidneys. Terms of lower organs, which is referring to emotions. Put on bowels of mercies, which translated is compassionate hearts. Let's write that down. Compassionate hearts. Now, there's versions out there, in this different Bible versions, that seek to provide idiomatic equivalent renderings. What does idiomatic come from? Idiom. Basically, let me give you an example. Let's think of one. Kick the bucket. Now, for someone that doesn't understand exactly what kick the bucket could mean in the different definitions in today's English language, say you go halfway across the world, they really don't understand the English language that well, and they hear kick the bucket, so they try to put two and two together to find out what exactly that means. They can picture themselves kicking an actual bucket. But we, even though that's one way to explain it, to define it, but we also could say, in an idiomatic way, kick the bucket, like that meaning somebody died. Well, he kicked the bucket, or she kicked the bucket. They passed away or they died. So in a lot of these versions out there that you see now, these Bible versions, they seek to provide these idiomatic equivalent renderings, and you can see it evident in the bowels of mercy. Seems like it's out of place, and that's one of the reasons why you can't find in what they say are literal renderings in these other versions. And one of the biggest culprit, by the way, which I checked, is the New Living Translation. You all heard the Living Bible years ago. Well, now it's the New Living Translation. I believe one of the most corrupted translations that's out there. And unfortunately, you'll be surprised how many pastors are using that. It just tells me that they haven't done their research. But that's another whole story. However, it must also be acknowledged that the translation of the Hebrew or the Greek, which I'm not going to get into the words that are used here tonight, though they have had the same meaning as our English word heart, it is incorrect. Because actually, the word refers to mind. Now, I made a big deal out of that in the Change of Mind series concerning repentance. So, when you look at the Hebrew and the Greek, it's best to refer to this thought of what is being said by David as someone that actually had the mind of God to carry out his will. Now, there's another word after in the verses. You go back and read it on your own time. The word after, let's write that down. When used in this verse or sentence, presents another issue. See, once again, you have to go to Bible English. In this case, 1611 Bible English. If you're using the King James Version, it might seem like an outdated use from the 17th century because we necessarily don't think of it that way any longer. But after was frequently used to mean according to. According to. And this is the meaning of the Greek preposition that we find here in Acts 13:22, and also in the Hebrew in 1 Samuel 13:14. They both mean according to. Now, to translate this into an idiomatic current English, it would be something like, now put it up on the screen, what I gave you earlier. Now, it would be something like a man who will do according to what God has in mind. To put it another way, you see it there also on the screen, David was a king who would carry out God's plan. How was David a man after God's own heart? Because he was a man who would do, who will do according to what God has in mind. He would carry out God's purposes. And we saw both in in 1 Samuel and in Acts, Saul wouldn't do it. He rebelled against God. David might have had his flaws. He had his ups and downs in his roller coaster ride. But when push came to shove, he was a man who would do according to what God has in mind. David was a king who would carry out God's plan. And that's what the original language is. And that was kind of the missing piece for me. Not that all the other stuff I tried to briefly describe to you, and I know I went quickly through it, but I think I gave you enough so you could get the gist of what I was saying. Not all the other things that are describing feelings and emotions that are usually attached to people's preachings and writings to compassionate hearts and love and all that. We knew David loved God. That was a given. What made David different is he was a man who would do according to what God has in mind. My mic fell off. There you go. And that is what the original language meant by this term. My prayer in 2024, that the Lord makes us a people. He makes us a church who will do according to what God has in mind for us to do. Not just in 2024, even though we're now just beginning in 2024, but every year that we have left. May we be a people who will do according to what God has in mind for us, individually and as a church. That's my greatest prayer for us. The one I'll pray often throughout 2024. In fact, I'll have them posted on the pastor's blog on occasion. Just as a reminder, we're here for a purpose. God's chose you and called you for a purpose. I was going to start 2024 with a spiritual warfare message. I'll preach that maybe next time. I thought it was important to reflect back on what God is looking for today, tomorrow, the rest of this year, and the years that we still have left. Not that soft, cushiony explanation of why people think that David was a man after God's own heart. No. David was a man who would do according to what God has in mind. That was his desire. Even though he sinned with the best of them. Even though he failed with the best of them. Even though he had victories beyond any of them. What's remembered in Acts that he was a man who would do according to what God has in mind. David was a king who carried out God's plan. Let faith come by hearing. Put your name in it also. Be a ministry or be a person who would carry out God's plan that he has for you, what he has for me, what he has for all of us. Let's make that our banner as we march on in 2024 and beyond. You got it? If you do, I want to hear from you.